Hello, I'm Spencer Curry, and with me today is Sean Dashkowitz, and we will be discussing, from 1931 to 1941, Japanese politics and economics and their impact on their foreign relations. So first, Japan encountered some early economic strife from the Showa Depression of 1930 to 1932. It was caused by the Great Depression that was started in the United States with the stock market crash in October 1929, which had far-reaching effects in economies globally. Furthermore, there were deflationary policies in place enacted by the Japanese government in order to eliminate weak banks as the nation prepared to reinstate the gold standard. Some impacts. There were very negative social effects as poverty was produced within the rural Japanese population. For instance, in 1934, a rationing system was instated in the country, and overall, criticism against the government and big business grew. Output restrictions were also enforced that affected the entire material industry of Japan. And most importantly, right-wing movements grew. And these right-wing movements influenced larger public sentiment that Japan must strive to protect its assets due to its manufacturing-style economy and its need for raw materials. And they emphasized that these assets should be held with greater military control. Some more impacts. There was the economic struggle led to a growth in manufacturing, like I just said. At one point, 30% of Japan's GDP was composed of manufacturing and the mining industry, except this need for materials led to a need for expansion by the Japanese, and as we will see, this prompted the Japanese to invade other nations such as China, as we'll see. So the need for raw materials directly led to the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, in which Japan sought raw materials, labor, and land on which they could expand their manufacturing economy, because it made up such a large portion of their economy as a whole. And so, touching on the foreign relations side of things, the League of Nations simply condemned Japan's actions without enacting any sanctions or strict regulations against their actions. And then Japan, as we know, invaded China in 1937, and they pretty much said, "Hey, League of Nations, we don't have any promises, and we're pretty much going to do whatever it takes to allow our economy to expand." And then at one point, economic policies changed as changes of government took place. So the anti-big business Minsai Party was removed from power in 1931 and replaced with the Sayukai government. Sayukai favored government control in big business, and his finance minister, Korekiyo Takahashi, immediately made some changes. He removed the gold standard. He made the Bank of Japan buy government bonds to stimulate economic growth, and he lowered interest rates. And so as a result, economic recovery was apparent, and the economy grew through 1936 and even into wartime. Then, in 1937, war breaks out versus China and Japan. So, like I've been saying, an expanding Japanese economy needs land, materials, and labor. And seen on this graph here, the purple line representing Japan, the change in their industrial production greatly began to grow beginning in 1931, continuing all the way on this higher level through 1935 to 1937. And so as a result, with the breaking out of this war in which Japan occupied Beijing and then Nanking, Japan was seeking these raw materials and these abilities to keep growing its economy. And this was actually regarded by some historians as the beginning of World War II, with Japan entering China. And some numbers from 1920 to 1929, the gross domestic product of Japan was 1.8, or the change was 1.8. From 1930 to 1931, it grew by 0.7, and from 1932 to 1936, it grew by 6.1.
We've talked about some of the economic issues. We're going to go ahead and move to the home front politics. Now, some background is that the government was actually consistent with the Meiji Constitution, which was created in 1889. In this constitution, it said that there was going to be no personal liberties guaranteed, that the emperor held all power, and that the military and the state, or the parliament, were broken into separate spheres. However, in most cases, the military had more power and influenced both the emperor and foreign policy more than the legislator. After the Mukden incident, for example, the Japanese took Manchuria by force, and the civilian government was unable to stop any army from taking Manchuria. If we look at another thing that actually leads to the military being more powerful, is that there was an emergence of ultranationalist civilians that were actually against the Japanese government, portraying them as anti-Japanese. An example of this is the Black Dragon Society, which was against party government, big business, acculturation, and westernizations, things favored by many in the political system. In addition to this, patriots and terrorists in Tokyo sought to replace the party government with a totalitarian military government through the use of violence. A military government would support foreign expansion and therefore hopefully get them out of the effects of the Great Depression. Now, in 1936, there was a military revolt in Tokyo, and this only further shifted the power to the military. Several statesmen trying to restore the civilian government's power were assassinated following the revolt. Finally, unlike the Diet, the military was not subject to state control, and used this power to assassinate numerous politicians who spoke out against the military. Moderates and conservatives during the war who were against expansion were killed, leaving no real opposition to radical foreign policy. Those like the League of Blood were ultranationalist groups that assassinated those like the finance minister and the head of the Rikken Menacito political party. This was done in 1932. In this case of serious opposition, the group was quickly put on trial, but on trial they were able to preach their ultranationalist beliefs, and many Japanese secretly agreed with the aims of the group. This only helped further the power of the military over the legislation. In 1941, finally, there was a coup that put General Hideaki in power, and this concreted the military's power over the civilian government. Because of all of this, the government was able to act within the war and with an aggressive foreign policy that the civilian government could not stop. Moving on, we get to government propaganda and censorship. Perhaps one of the biggest uses of propaganda was the idea of superiority. In the 1930s, the government used Shintoism, the Chinese religion, to convince Japanese of their superiority. To further this, they also used propaganda to show that the Japanese were the superior Asian race. This was further supported in the Tripartite Pact in 1949, which established Japan as the new order in Asia. This was eventually challenged by emerging China, another region that Manchuria was invaded. Finally, it gave Japan a moral excuse for an invasive foreign policy. Moving on, the press was also censored. In 1936, the Propaganda Committee was created, which worked with the publication's monitoring department on censorship issues. Censorship of things like the rape of Nanking only furthered the effects described under superiority propaganda.
World War II officially begins in 1938, and Japan takes some pretty hard hits. First, they had many harsh military losses, such as Iwo Jima, the Midway, and some U.S. firebomb raids. There was also the atomic bomb that hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In total, the Japanese lost at least 2.6 million men, and 40% of Japanese factories and infrastructure were destroyed. However, Japan still had some holdings in Manchuria that were previously done out of their manufacturing economy, except at this point, they were starting to look toward French Indochina. So, as Japan occupies French Indochina, the USA responds with an oil embargo enacted by FDR of September of 1940. Japan worries that they now have a limited supply of oil because 80% of Japan's oil came from the US, and that they worried that action needed to occur soon to establish their place in the war and to not be defeated. This led to the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th of 1940 by Japan against the US in response to economic pressure that, like I said, led to this sense of urgency in Japanese military actions. This prompts the US to join the war, destroying any positive relations that could have existed between itself and Japan. And so, following the war, Japan experiences a sort of rebirth. The destruction of their infrastructure led to a new opportunity to rebuild it in a more modern fashion, and later GDP began to grow at 9% per year, although it must be said that USA occupations did assist them in doing so.
In addition to this, at the end of the war, a democratic government was set up to end the political strife of pre-war Japan. At the Potsdam Conference, it was agreed that the Allies would occupy Japan following the Allied victory. Under General MacArthur, a new constitution was created, modeled after the British government. A cabinet, prime minister, and diet were created. In this constitution, it also said the Japanese could never again use war as a means to settle dispute. This constitution was put into effect May 3rd, 1947. In conclusion, economically, Japan is a manufacturing country that needs raw materials. Because of this, they invade China and Indochina. This produces some negative effects within the West. Politics. The Japanese people suffered from the hemorrhaging of the military and the state government. This causes an increased interest in expansion and is fixed only by Japanese defeat.
Thank you.